Welcome to Crack It. Today we are going to discuss about the frequently asked interview questions in the RESTful web services. This is a microservices world, so all the services we are creating or most of the services we are creating are the RESTful web services. And we'll try to understand most of the interview questions with the coding examples. RESTful web services and microservices are interlinked, so there are chances that few of the questions will be covered in the microservices interview question series and few will be covered in the RESTful interview services series. So we have started the series new just to cover the commonly asked interview questions in the RESTful web services. We'll try to explain all the concepts clearly along with coding examples. Let's start the discussion. Also, we have started this channel new and we request you to like, comment, share and subscribe this channel if you like the content. What are RESTful web services? First of all, what is REST? REST is nothing but the representational state transfer. So any web services that leverages the REST architecture is called as the RESTful web services. So what is REST architecture? REST architecture is nothing but an architecture which has the client and the server. Client will request for the resources and server will have the resources. So that is called as the REST architecture. So what is REST architecture? It is mainly the client and the server, and the client will request the server for the resources and the server will serve the client requests and responds to the client with some response. That is the REST architecture. So any web service that leverages this REST architecture concept of client and server is called as the RESTful web services. So why are we using this RESTful web services? We are using this RESTful web services to create the APIs for our web-based applications. So what is the protocol that it uses? It uses the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP protocol. Also, what are the important features that we can remember if they ask about a RESTful web services, or what are the benefits of using RESTful web services? So the main benefits of RESTful web services are lightweight. It provides easier maintainability and the RESTful web services are easier to scale. Also, it supports communication between the applications that are developed in different languages. So here comes the microservices principle. As I told earlier, microservices and RESTful are like interlinked. So how is it like if suppose I have like 100 applications and I want to communicate, I cannot develop all my 100 applications in a single language. So maybe say I have 3 microservices A, B and C. A is developed in Java, B in Node.js and C in some other language. A need to talk to B. There is no mandatory rule that A and B should be developed in the same language if A needs to call B. No, that's not the case. Even though A and B are developed in different languages, A can call B. Why? Because those are RESTful web services and they follow the REST principles. So this RESTful web services supports communication between the multiple applications even though they are developed in the different languages. This will be a short question if you are using RESTful web services. What is it? What are the best practices for designing RESTful web services? Even though you are not asked in the interview, in this question, this will be very helpful if you're developing RESTful web services on your own or RESTful APIs on your own. Whenever we develop something, we need to follow the best practices. So what are those best practices for designing the RESTful API? So first is implementing appropriate security measures such as authentication and authorization. So if I am developing a RESTful web services for any application, that should be secure, that should be authenticated and authorized. Authenticated means suppose if I am developing an application for an organization, only the employees of that organization needs to access that API. That is authentication. And what is authorization? In an organization, we will have roles like developer, senior developer, manager, so forth and so on. So only any person who has the role of manager can access specific APIs. So for that we need to implement authorization. So if we are developing any RESTful API, we need to be very careful. We need to implement the security measures such as authentication and authorization. It's not like there are open APIs, but if we are not developing any open APIs, then we should be very careful in implementing the security measures. This is a very, very important point. First principle we need to follow: implementing security in our application. Second, using descriptive and meaningful resource URIs. So if I'm going to create an API, the URL that I'm using should be like descriptive and meaningful. Suppose if I'm going to expose a product, or if I'm going to create an API for the product, then the URL of the API should be like slash products. Instead, I should not give it like slash interviews or slash something else. If I'm going to develop a product, then I need to give my URI as products. Then what next? Using HTTP methods appropriately for the intended actions. So what is this? If suppose I'm going to create a product, then I need to use post. I should not use a get HTTP method to create a product. So we should be very careful on using which HTTP method we are going to use for our REST API. Then what next? Providing clear and consistent naming conventions. Yes, this is a straightforward. We need to use a proper naming convention for our RESTful API. The next is properly documenting the API using standards like OpenAPI. Yes, without documentation, APIs will not be of any use. Like after explaining this, I'll open a public API and I'll show you how they document, how they did all these things. I'll show you. Anyways, so proper documentation is required. So, and if we are going to give our API, give our web service to someone for use, they should know which specific API they want to use and for what purpose they want to use, what are the request parameters, what are the URLs they need to follow, what are the possible responses they may get. So, for all these reasons, we need to properly document our API. What next? Handling errors and providing informative error responses. If there is an error, the caller should know what exactly what wrong they did. So our error handling should be like very efficient, and that should be informative as well. Next is versioning the API. So I'll cover a separate video for versioning the API. So in the versioning, we have something called major, minor, and patch. So if we are going to introduce any breaking change, then we will call it as a major, and we will create a new version for that. Even though we will create a new version, we should support backward compatibility in our RESTful web services, and that's called as and that is the last point, versioning the API to ensure backward compatibility. So in Google, I search for open REST APIs, and there are like list of APIs they have listed. In it, I'll choose one and I'll open something. Suppose say I'll open GitHub free APIs. So let me go and see what are the APIs available. So if you see here, a lot of APIs is available as a free source. So we can see whether the authorization is implemented or not. In few of the APIs, authorization is implemented. In few, it is not implemented. And suppose if I open one of those and if I go to the API documentation, this is the documentation they have provided. So what are they have given, like what are the endpoints they have used, and what are the models involved in developing these endpoints. So in the endpoints, if I go, this is like a fax get endpoint they have created. This is a get call and this is the endpoint, and these are the query parameters that are used by this endpoint, and what is the purpose of these query parameters, along with the description and what are the possible values for those query parameters. So like this, we need to document our REST API that we are creating properly. Why? Because it is a very best practice. Suppose if I am creating a web service and I am giving it for the consumption of someone else, they should know what are the endpoints that the API has. Only then they can use this endpoint. Only if they know what is the endpoint and what are the parameters they can pass, what is the request URL they need to pass, what is the possible response that they can get. Only by knowing all these information, they will be able to consume the API properly without any issues. So if it is always best to document our API properly. So if you see here, this is a get call. Why it is a get call? Because they are using it to retrieve some information called fax. So for retrieving the information, they should use only the get endpoint, which is the HTTP get method. So likewise, we need to follow all the best practices. Just for an example, I have opened this and I have showed you this. For all your if like there are like lots of open APIs, you can go check what is implemented there. That will be useful for developers when we develop some APIs. What are the principles of RESTful web services? First one is very important, that is uniform interface. So let's try to understand it. Suppose I am creating an API for movies. My URL should be like slash movies. And if I'm going to get a specific movie information from the API, then my URL should be like slash movies slash movie ID. If I need to get the directors involved in that movie, then I need to give it like movies slash movie ID slash directors slash director ID, so forth and so on. So for any of the APIs that we are developing, we need to follow a uniform interface. So by like uniform interface, so we need to follow a single a language for the communication between the client and the server. That is the uniform interface. So any client should understood by seeing the URL that what they are going to fetch, that common language that we are using for is the uniform interface. Second is client server. Yes, RESTful web services is developed for the client and server. So the client server should operate independently. There should be no dependency between these two. That's the principle of the RESTful web services. Next is stateless. What is stateless? The client will not store any information about the server. I'll explain in detail about stateless in the next slide. For now, what is stateless? The client will not have any information about the server. Next is cacheable. Yes, RESTful web services can be developed, can be efficiently used if it is cacheable. Next is layered architecture. Yes, it is a layered architecture. Why? Because we will have clients, we will have server, in between we may have load balancers, we may have API gateways. So the client and server communication is like defined layer by layer. This is a layered architecture. What next? Next is code on demand. So all these are the important principles of the RESTful web services. What is the concept of statelessness in web services, or why is REST architecture called stateless? So first of all, REST architecture is maintained mainly for the client and the server communication. If the client needs something, the client will go check the server for that information, and the server in turn will respond to the client with the information requested. So this is how the communication between the client and server happens in the RESTful web services. So suppose a server may have like 10 clients. Will the server store all the information about those 10 clients so that it can serve those clients easily, or it will know what the client may request it to, or what the special information that it can provide to the client? No, that is not the case. The server will not store any data about the client. The server will not know that these many clients that it has. So that is called as statelessness. Previously in the monolithic architecture, we will store the session information in our application, but now in the RESTful web services, it is not the case. It will not store the state of the client, and that is called as statelessness. The client is completely responsible for storing and handling the session related information. Server will not do anything related to session. So the client is responsible for all its handling of the session related activities. Also, in every HTTP request happens in isolation. So the server will not remember who the client is or what its previous request is. So each and every request is different for the server. So statelessness means that every HTTP request that goes to the server happens in complete isolation. This statelessness has advantages and disadvantages as well. Let's first see the advantages of the statelessness. What is it? Like, the RESTful web services are easier to scale. Why? Because it doesn't maintain any state of the client. So if it has the state of the client, then we need to think like how we can scale that application. So here, since we are not storing any information related to the client, it is very easy for us to scale our APIs to the millions of concurrent users. Why? Because even though the concurrent users may from the different clients, the server is not dependent on who the client is. So it's like very easy to scale since it does not store any session related dependencies in it. Second is improved performance. Why? Because it does not store any information about the client, so it is very easy for this. For all the clients, the request is same to the servers, thus the performance is improved. Next is decreased complexity. Why? Because there is no need for us to do the server side synchronization. Previously in the monolithic applications we need to do the server side synchronization, but now it's not the case. It is not required for us to maintain the server side synchronization, and thus the REST APIs are not at all complex. What are the disadvantages now? So the main disadvantages is increased request size. Why? Because since the server is not storing any information about the client, for each of its requests, client needs to send information about it. So client will send information on what it needs to get. Along with that, it will send its information as well. So my request size will become huge. So since a lot of additional information must be sent along with each request for the client, the request size will become huge. Second is network latency. So this repeated data transfer, since the server will not store any information about the client, so repeated data transfer will happen, and that may decrease network performance. Commonly used HTTP methods in the REST based architecture. So when will we use get? Get is used to retrieve the representation of a resource. When we are retrieving the information, then we will go for the get. Next is post. When we are creating a resource, we'll go for the post HTTP method. When we are going to update an existing resource, then we'll go for the put. When we are partially updating the resource, then the HTTP method that needs to be used is patch. When we are deleting a resource, the HTTP method that needs to be used is delete. Options HTTP methods is used to return the supported methods for a resource. Suppose I have an API and I want to know, suppose I have an API called /products, and I want to know what are the HTTP methods that are supported for the specific API products. Then if I go with options /products, then I'll know what are the methods that are supported for that resource. So what's the difference between put and the patch request? So if I'm going to update my request, then update my resource, then I need to go with either put or patch. When to use put, when to use patch, that makes the difference. So if I'm going to update the entire resource, entire object, then I need to go with a put. So put is used to replace an existing resource with a completely a new one. Suppose say I have an endpoint /products and I want to update the product ID 1. So I need to replace the entire product ID 1 with the new value that I'm going to send through the postman. So in that case, I need to use put. Why? Because I'm going to update the entire product ID P1 with some other value. So I need to update the entire resource, then I need to go with put. Put is used to replace an existing resource with a completely a new one. In other words, if you send a put request to update a resource, the server will completely replace the existing resource with the new one. So my request body will have the entire object of the product. Suppose in patch, say I want to deactivate the product P1, then what will I do? I'll just send status : deactivated in my request body, and that will deactivate my product. So I will not send the entire I'm not going to update my entire product P1, but I'm just deactivating my product P1. In that case, I need to go with patch. When I'm going to make a partial update to an existing resource, then I need to go with patch. So put, when do I need to use? When I'm going to update completely a new one. Patch, when do I need to use? When I'm going to perform a partial update. So next question. So what are the purposes of the HTTP status codes in the REST API? So even if you remember in the OpenAPI documentation we saw, they have written some status codes. So why are the status codes useful? Why? Because HTTP status codes provides information about the outcome of the request that we sent. So I'm sending some request to the server. I want to know what happens to the request. What is the outcome of the request? How will I know? By seeing the status codes of my response. So If my status code in the response is 200, then there's no problem with it. It is success. It is a okay response. If it is 201, usually we will use this for post and the put methods. If I want to create something and I'm posting the request, and if it is successful, if that object is created, then I'll get 201. What is 400? If there is something wrong with my request, so if there is a mandatory field which I missed to send, then what will happen? The response code will be 400, which is bad request. What is 401? Unauthorized. If you remember, for few of the open APIs visa, authorization has been implemented. If I try to call that without any authorization key or token, then what will happen? It will say as 401 unauthorized. What is 403? Forbidden, which when I have no access to the resource. I have no access to the resource, but I'm trying to access it. By the time I'll get 403. What is 404? Not found, which means that endpoint is not at all present. Suppose say there is no endpoint, get endpoint for /product, but I'm trying to access it with the DNS information, then what will happen? It will throw 404 not found. What is 500? There is an unexpected error that has happened in the server, that will throw 500. There are few other status code, but these are the common status codes that are used in the REST API. And what is its purpose? Its purpose is to say us about what has happened to the request that has sent to the server. This is the responses status code. So you may get a question like, how are you handling the error responses in your REST API? So what will you do? So if you have a REST API, then you need to handle your error responses properly. So what is that properly? That properly is nothing but your error response should include error message. So what has happened? Why this is throwing error? That error message information. If it is because of a validation error, say suppose a field should accept only values from 1 to 100, but by mistake I've sent 150, then I need to know that I need to send 1 to 100 for that field and not 150. So that information, validation error information, the error codes. Suppose if in my REST API, if I am following some error codes, then I need to throw that error codes as well. So if there is some error codes with few links through which they can be rectified, those links or any other resources to resolve that error, all those information should be present in the error response. So error response should include a valid HTTP status code. Suppose there is a error due to the validation error, which means that error is due to the invalid request, which should have 400 status code. So we need to return the appropriate status code along with these additional information. So what is idempotent API and what are the HTTP methods those are idempotent? I'll cover that as a separate video along with the example. So idempotent will be easy if I explain through code. So I'll cover that as a separate video. Also I'll cover REST API versioning along with coding example. So please stay tuned. We will cover all those scenarios in our future videos of the RESTful web series. Thanks for watching Crackit. Please do like, comment, share and subscribe for updates.